The heart rate monitor flatlined at 3:14 a.m. Not a glitch, not a warning. A steady, piercing drone. Right there in the master bedroom of the Kang estate, under the watchful eyes of 3 hidden cameras, on the single most important night of Kang Yi-hyun's life. He didn't twitch. He didn't gasp. He took one slow, internal breath and maintained the lie the way he always maintained his empire. Silently, with lethal precision, and with an absolute commitment to the deception. Day 4, fake Coma, ruthless head of the Xingguang syndicate. This was the role he had staged for weeks, the trap his enemies were already walking into, the silence that was his greatest weapon. He felt the silk sheets beneath him, expensive, cold, and smelling faintly of a perfume that no longer felt like home. The heavy oak door clicked open. It wasn't the frantic, heavy stride of a wife losing her husband. It was the rhythmic, confident tap of Han Soo-min's stilettos. She didn't rush to the bedside. She didn't call for the nurses. Instead, the sound of a lipstick cap popping open echoed in the clinical silence of the room. Yi-hyun remained a statue. Through the thin veil of his eyelashes, he watched her silhouette in the vanity mirror. She was humming, a light, airy tune that felt like a dance on his grave. "You always did look better when you weren't talking, Yi-hyun," she whispered. Her voice was smooth, devoid of a single tremor of grief. She leaned into the mirror, perfecting a crimson pout. "The house is so much quieter without your orders. Your men are already looking to me for answers, and soon they'll look to me for everything else." She walked toward him, the scent of her expensive lilies clogging his senses. She leaned down, her face inches from his. He could feel her breath on his cheek. The woman he had protected for 5 years was now calculating the exact moment his heart would actually stop. "Hurry up and die, Yi-hyun," she breathed, her voice a cold caress. "You're making the furniture smell like a funeral." She straightened up, adjusted her blazer, and swept out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Yi-hyun waited. He counted his heartbeats, forcing them to remain slow, steady, and mechanical. He was ready to wake up. He was ready to end the game and tear her world apart. But then the shadow moved. It wasn't Soo-min. It was Ara, the maid who usually kept her head so low she seemed part of the architecture. She stepped into the room, but she didn't have a cleaning cloth or a tray. She walked to the bedside with a strange, fluid grace. She didn't check the monitors. She didn't check his IV. Instead, she reached out a gloved hand and gently smoothed a stray hair from Yi-hyun's forehead. Then she leaned down, her lips brushing the shell of his ear. "You can stop holding your breath, boss," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a dark, secret warmth. "The cameras are on a loop. I made sure of it." Yi-hyun's internal world shifted. His finger gave a microscopic twitch, one he couldn't suppress. "Don't worry," Ara continued, her eyes locked onto his closed lids as if she could see the fire burning behind them. "I won't tell her, but from now on, you aren't the one playing the game. We are." The room returned to a silence that felt heavier than before. Ara had withdrawn into the shadows of the corner, moving with the practiced invisibility that had allowed her to blend into the mansion's wallpaper for months. Yi-hyun lay perfectly still, his body a silent tomb, but his mind was a storm. "She knows." The realization was a jagged blade. He had spent years vetting every soul in his inner circle, yet this girl, a woman who moved through his halls like a ghost, had peered through the armor of his paralysis in a single night. Through the slit of his vision, he watched the rest of the staff filter in for the morning shift. They were predictable. The head of security entered first, his eyes scanning the monitors but never the man. To him, Yi-hyun was already a relic, a fallen king whose crown was up for grabs. Then came the doctor, a man Yi-hyun had paid handsomely for years, who checked the IV drip with hands that trembled slightly. He didn't look at Yi-hyun's face, he looked at the floor, the guilt of his silence already weighing on his shoulders. None of them looked at him. To them, he was already dead, a piece of meat kept warm by a machine. They spoke about him in the past tense, their voices rising in volume as their respect withered in the face of his perceived helplessness. They discussed the shifting power in the syndicate and the rumors of Soo-min's new alliances. They were vultures circling a carcass, waiting for the heartbeat to stop so the feast could begin. Except for Ara. She returned to his bedside under the guise of changing the linens. While the others avoided his gaze as if his corpse were a curse, Ara leaned over him. She didn't look at his chest to check his breathing. She looked directly at his eyes. Even with his lids nearly closed, Yi Hyun felt the heat of her stare. It wasn't the gaze of a servant. It was the gaze of a hunter who had found something precious in the brush. She worked slowly, her fingers brushing against his arm with a lingering pressure that felt like a secret code. "The lawyer is in the study," she murmured, her voice so low it was barely a vibration against the hum of the ventilator. She was polishing the bedside table, her movements rhythmic and mundane, but her words were fire. "He has the second will, the one you thought was destroyed. Sumin promised him 10% to make sure the original never sees the light of day." Yi Hyun's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. He expected the monitor to betray him, to scream his agitation to the room. But the steady asterisk beep, beepy beep remained unchanged. He looked at Ara's hand. She was holding a small, black device, a signal jammer disguised as a cleaning sponge. She was feeding the monitors a false rhythm, masking his rage with a digital lie. She leaned closer, the scent of her skin, something sharp and metallic, like rain on a blade, overpowering the cloying lilies. "They think you're a ghost, Yi Hyun, but a ghost can't strike back. I can." She straightened his pillow, her eyes never leaving his. In that moment, Yi Hyun realized his god complex had blinded him. He had faked this coma to see who would betray him, thinking he was the only player on the board. He had looked at the kings and the queens, the bishops and the knights. He had never looked at the pawn. And now, the pawn was leaning down, tucking the blanket around his chin with a terrifying tenderness. "Don't worry, boss," she whispered, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I've always preferred the dark. It's where the real work gets done." As she turned to leave, she did something that chilled him more than his wife's death wish. She reached out and deliberately turned the hidden camera on the bookshelf an inch to the left, perfectly obscuring the bed. She wasn't just watching him. She was hiding him. And for the first time in his life, Kang Yi-hyun realized that being the one who sees everything doesn't mean a thing if you're the one trapped in the frame. The air in the room had changed. The clinical, sterile scent of antiseptic had been aggressively replaced by a cloying, heavy sweetness that made Yi-hyun's internal alarms scream. It was the smell of white lilies, thick, waxy, and to him, lethal. Yuara entered the room carrying a massive crystalline vase overflowing with the pale blooms. She moved with a serene, terrifying deliberateness, placing them on the nightstand mere inches from his face. To any observer, it was a gesture of devotion, a maid bringing life into a room defined by stasis. But Yi-hyun knew better. He was deathly allergic to lilies. Even a few grains of their pollen could close his throat in minutes. This wasn't just a test of his physical endurance. It was an execution disguised as a kindness. Within seconds, the biological betrayal began. His throat felt as though it were being lined with crushed glass. The itch started deep in his lungs, a desperate primal urge to cough that threatened to shatter his mask of paralysis. His skin began to burn, a hives-induced fire spreading across his chest beneath the silk pajamas. He fought for every microscopic breath, forcing his lungs to expand and contract with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, even as they felt like they were filling with lead. Ara didn't walk away. She pulled up a chair and sat beside him, leaning forward until her face was framed by the very petals that were poisoning him. She rested her chin on her hand, her eyes wide and luminous, watching him with the focused intensity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" she mused. Her voice was a soft purr that cut through the mounting roar in his ears. "Sumin hates them. She says they smell like rot. But I remembered you mentioning them once, years ago. Or perhaps I just knew they'd get a reaction out of you." Yi-hyun's heart rate began to climb. On the monitor, the digital line spiked. 95, 110, 125. The alarm should have been blaring, summoning the nurses, alerting his wife that the vegetable was in respiratory distress. But the room remained silent. Ara reached out, her fingers dancing over the signal jammer she had installed. On the screen visible to the hallway cameras, his heart rate remained a perfect, peaceful 72. "Look at that," she whispered, pointing at the true reading on her handheld device. "Your body is screaming, Yi Hyun. You're suffocating right in front of me, and yet you won't move a muscle. Your pride is even stronger than your reflex to live. I find that intoxicating." She picked up a single lily, snapping the stem with a sharp asterisk crack that sounded like a bone breaking. She brushed the pollen-heavy stamen against his cheek, leaving a yellow stain on his pale skin. Yi Hyun's vision began to gray at the edges. His heart hit 140. His entire existence was reduced to a single, agonizing command: don't blink, don't gasp, don't die. Ara leaned in so close their noses almost touched. She could surely feel the heat radiating from his allergic fever. A slow, genuine smile spread across her lips, the first real emotion he had seen on her face. It wasn't the smile of a maid, or even a rival. It was the smile of someone who had finally found an equal in the art of suffering. "You're doing so well," she cooed, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "But we both know you can't keep this up forever. The more you fight the air, the more you belong to me. Sumin wants you dead, Yi Hyun. But I want to see how much of this you can take before you finally beg me to take the flowers away." She stayed there for an hour, a silent sentinel in a garden of slow-acting poison, watching him drown in the open air. When she finally rose to leave, she took the vase with her, but the scent remained, trapped in his lungs. As the door clicked shut, Yi Hyun let out a single, shuddering breath that was half gasp, half snarl. He was alive, but the hierarchy of the house had been decimated. He was no longer the predator in the shadows. He was the captive of a woman who knew exactly how to make his heart stop without ever touching a weapon. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, its chimes sounding like the tolling of a distant bell for the damned. The scent of the lilies had faded into a ghostly trace, but the lingering irritation in Yi Hyun's throat remained a bitter reminder of the maid's presence. He lay in the pitch-black room, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge, waiting for the night's next betrayal. He didn't have to wait long. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of light from the hallway and the low, hushed tones of a conversation that wasn't meant for the living. Two sets of footsteps entered. One was the sharp, staccato rhythm of Sumin's heels. The other was a heavy, arrogant stride that Yi Hyun recognized instantly. It was Park Joon-gi, his primary rival, and the man who had been clawing at the edges of the Xinguang syndicate for years. "It's grotesque in here," Joon-gi muttered, his voice dripping with a mixture of disgust and triumph. "How can you stand the smell of the machines?" "I don't smell the machines, Joon-gi. I smell the paperwork," Sumin replied. There was a soft rustle of silk as she sat on the edge of Yi Hyun's bed, the very place she had told him to hurry up and die only hours before. "The lawyer is waiting in the library. He's already drafted the amendment." Yi Hyun felt the mattress sink under her weight. He felt her hand reach out, but she didn't touch him with affection. Instead, she rested her palm over his mouth, as if checking for the faintest sign of breath, her fingers cold and indifferent. "And the board?" Joon-gi asked. "Handled," Sumin said, and Yi Hyun could hear the predatory smile in her voice. "The original will leave 40% of the holdings to his loyal lieutenants and the rest to a blind trust. But our friend at the firm has found a way to invalidate the witness signatures. The new version leaves everything to me. Once I'm in control, the merger with your firm is a mere formality." The betrayal hit Yi Hyun harder than the lack of oxygen had. He had handpicked his lawyer, a man he had rescued from a disgraced career and elevated to a position of immense wealth. To hear that the man had turned his coat for a percentage of the spoils was a calculated strike at the very center of Yi Hyun's ego. He had prided himself on knowing what every man's price was. He simply hadn't realized his own life was the currency. "What if he wakes up?" Joon-gi's voice was closer now. Yi Hyun felt the man's shadow loom over him. "The doctors say the brain activity is inconsistent." "He won't wake up," Sumin said firmly. "The lawyer is bringing the final papers for me to sign tonight. By dawn, the legal transition will be complete. If he survives the week, we'll move him to the facility in Jeju. Out of sight, out of mind, until his heart finally decides to do the right thing. Yi Hyun listened as they began to whisper about the liquidation of his assets, discussing his empire as if it were nothing more than a collection of old furniture to be sold at auction. They spoke with a terrifying casualness, their voices blending into a drone of greed and ambition. But through the haze of his fury, Yi Hyun noticed something. The door to the room hadn't been fully closed. In the thin gap of the doorway, a shadow stood motionless. It wasn't the guard. The silhouette was too slight, the posture too precise. It was Ara. She was standing in the darkness of the hall, invisible to the two lovers in the room, watching them with the same terrifying focus she had used on him. She wasn't just eavesdropping, she was collecting. As Sumin leaned down to press a mocking, final kiss to Yi Hyun's forehead, the shadow in the doorway shifted. Ara didn't intervene. She didn't call out. She simply raised a small, glowing screen, her phone, and captured the image of the rival and the wife standing over the dying boss. The game was no longer a simple matter of a husband testing a wife. As Joongi and Sumin walked out, laughing softly about their future, Yi Hyun realized he was trapped in a house where his enemies were at the front door. His lawyer was at his throat, and the only person who could save him was a maid who found his suffocation intoxicating. The morning light filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, bruised shadows across the room. The house felt hollowed out, the echoing laughter of Sumin and Joongi from the night before still vibrating in the floorboards. Yi Hyun lay in the center of the wreckage, his mind calculating every possible avenue of escape, every throat he would eventually have to cut. The door opened with a soft, familiar click. Ara entered, carrying a basin of warm water and a fresh cloth. She didn't look like a revolutionary or a blackmailer. She looked like the help, eyes downcast, shoulders slightly hunched, her movements quiet and deferential. But as she approached the bed, the air tensioned until it hummed. She dipped the cloth into the water and wrung it out. The sound of the droplets hitting the basin was deafening in the stillness. She began to clean his face, her touch lighter than a breath, starting at his forehead and moving down his jawline. It was a ritual of intimacy that Yi Hyun found increasingly difficult to endure. He could feel the heat of her skin, the steadiness of her hands. She was the only person in the world who touched him without fear. When she reached the yellow stain of the lily pollen on his cheek, she stopped. She dipped the cloth again, her eyes narrowing as she scrubbed the mark away with a sudden, sharp pressure. "They're busy in the library," she murmured, her voice barely a thread of sound. "The lawyer has a fountain pen made of gold. It's funny, isn't it? The price of a man's soul is so small it can fit in a breast pocket." She leaned closer, the damp warmth of the cloth resting against his neck. She wasn't just cleaning him anymore. She was pinning him down with her presence. She draped the towel over the basin and leaned over him until her hair brushed against his shoulder, creating a dark curtain that shielded them from the hidden cameras she had already manipulated. "You're wondering who I am," she whispered. Her breath was warm against the shell of his ear, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical air of the room. "You're wondering how a maid from a village in the north ended up in the house of the great King Yi Hyun." She paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic asterisk hiss-clack of the ventilator. Then, she spoke a name. Min Seo-yeon. The name hit Yi Hyun like a physical blow. It was a name buried under 2 decades of blood, concrete, and silence. It belonged to a world before the syndicate, before the power, before he had learned that the only way to survive was to become the monster under the bed. Min Seo-yeon was the girl from the shipyard fire, the one he had been told was dead, the one he had left behind to save himself. Yi Hyun's pupils constricted behind his closed lids. His heart rate gave a single, violent thump that Ara surely felt beneath her palm. "Did you think I forgot?" she asked, her voice dropping to a jagged, broken register. "Did you think 20 years was enough time for the ash to stop tasting like bitterness? I watched you build this mansion on top of that graveyard, Yi Hyun. I watched you buy a wife who doesn't love you and a lawyer who can't wait to bury you." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, though he kept them shut. She traced the line of his throat with a single, cool fingertip, the exact spot where the shipyard fire had left its mark on her, hidden beneath her high-collared uniform. "Soo-min wants your money. Joong-gi wants your throne," she whispered, her grip on the bedsheet tightening. "But I don't want either. I've waited 20 years to be the only person you see when you finally open your eyes. And the best part, you can't even run this time." She stood up, the basin of water splashing slightly as she gripped it. The mask of the submissive maid slid back into place, her expression becoming a blank slate once more. As she walked toward the door, she paused, looking back at the motionless man in the bed. "The lawyer is coming up in 10 minutes with the papers," she said, her voice flat and professional. "You have until then to decide if you want to die as a king or live as mine." The clock on the mantel ticked with a newfound aggression, each second echoing like a hammer against a nail. The weight of the name *Min Seoyeon still vibrated in Yi Hyun's skull, a ghost from the shipyard fire that had finally caught up to him. He was no longer just a man in a faked coma. He was a man trapped between a past that wanted his soul and a present that wanted his pulse to stop. The door didn't creak this time. It swung open with a heavy, final thud. Han Soo-min entered alone. She had changed into a black silk robe, the dark fabric flowing behind her like liquid ink. There was no lipstick mirror this time, no mocking humming. Her face was a mask of cold, sharp resolve. In her right hand, she held a small, professional medical tray. On it sat a single glass vial and a syringe, the needle catching the afternoon light and fracturing it into 1,000 tiny daggers. She walked to the bedside and set the tray down on the nightstand, right where the lilies had been. Yi Hyun watched her through the microscopic gap of his lashes. Her hands were steady, unnervingly so. She snapped the plastic cap off the syringe with a crisp, clinical sound. "The lawyer is finished, Yi Hyun," she said, her voice a low, melodic poison. "The papers are signed, the witnesses have been paid, and the board has accepted the transition of power. There's only one loose end left, one heartbeat that keeps the legal world from becoming mine." She plunged the needle into the vial, drawing back the plunger. The clear liquid bubbled as it filled the chamber. Yi Hyun knew exactly what was in that vial. It wouldn't be a messy poison. It would be a concentrated dose of potassium chloride. It would cause a sudden, massive heart attack, a tragic complication of his vegetative state. To the world, it would be the merciful end of a broken man. To him, it would be the end of everything. Soo-min leaned over him, her scent, that cloying, artificial floral note, filling his nostrils. She reached for the IV port on his arm. Her fingers were ice cold as they gripped his skin. "I really did try to be the wife you wanted," she whispered, her face inches from his. "But you were always so busy looking for betrayal in everyone else that you forgot to look at the person sharing your bed. You made me a widow long before you went into this coma, Yi Hyun. I'm just making it official." The needle hovered over the rubber port. This was the moment of the great choice. If Yi Hyun moved, if he reached up and crushed her throat with the strength he had been conserving for days, the lie would be shattered. He would survive, but he would be a criminal, a man who had faked his own death, and he would be immediately vulnerable to the syndicate's coup and the police. If he remained still, he would die a legend, but he would die. His muscles coiled, a predator's instinct screaming at him to strike. His heart rate began to climb, 100, 110, 120. He waited for the alarm on the monitor to sound, for the nurses to burst in, for anything to break the tension. But the room remained silent. Ara's jammer was still working, showing a peaceful, dying rhythm to the world while his actual heart threatened to beat out of his chest. Soo-min's thumb pressed against the plunger. The first drop of the lethal fluid beaded at the tip of the needle. Yi Hyun's hand, hidden beneath the silk sheet, tightened into a fist. He prepared to lung, to reveal the monster, to tear the room apart. But just as the needle touched the port, a hand clamped firmly onto Soo-min's wrist. It wasn't Yi Hyun. Ara stood there, her grip on Soo-min's arm so violent that the syringe jerked away. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like an executioner who had just claimed her prize. "Not yet, madam," Ara said, her voice as sharp as the needle. "He doesn't belong to you anymore." The silence of the room was shattered by the sharp intake of Soo-min's breath. She stared at the hand gripping her wrist, her eyes darting from the maid's face to the needle that had been inches from Yi Hyun's life. For a heartbeat, the power dynamic in the room hung suspended, a fragile glass ornament about to shatter. "Let go of me, you crazy bitch," Soo-min hissed, her voice vibrating with the shock of being touched by someone she considered furniture. She tried to yank her arm away, but Ara's grip didn't falter. Instead, the maid twisted Soo-min's wrist just enough to force the syringe toward the floor. "I wouldn't raise your voice, madam," Ara said. Her tone was terrifyingly level, a stark contrast to the wife's rising panic. "The hidden cameras in this room are currently feeding a live stream to a private server, not the loop I showed the security team, the real one. The one that shows you standing over your husband with a lethal dose of potassium. It shows you adjusting your lipstick in the monitor. It shows you laughing about the second will." Soo-min's face drained of color, the crimson of her lips now looking like a fresh wound against a ghost. You're lying, you're a maid. You don't have the resources." "I have 20 years of resources," Ara interrupted, her voice dropping to a low, melodic threat. "I have the recording of your meeting with Joongi last night. I have the bank records of the gift you sent to the lawyer. If I press one button, the Xinguang Council won't just take your inheritance, they'll take your head. You know how the syndicate treats traitors, don't you?" Soo-min looked down at Yi Hyun's motionless form, then back at the woman she had ignored for months. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been outplayed by the help. The predator had been being watched by a shadow she never thought to fear. "What do you want?" Soo-min whispered, her arrogance finally collapsing into raw desperation. "Money, name your price. I'll give you 5% of the trust." "I don't want your money, Soo-min. I want you to walk out of that door," Ara said, leaning in until their foreheads almost touched. "I want you to take your widow's grief and your lawyer and go to the villa in Jeju. Tell the board the stress was too much. Tell them you're taking a leave of absence. If you ever step foot in this mansion again, or if Joongi tries to call you, the video goes to the police and the syndicate simultaneously." "You can't keep him," Soo-min stammered, glancing at Yi Hyun. "He's a monster when he dies." "He isn't going to die, not yet," Ara smiled, and it was a cold, jagged thing. "He's mine now, I've bought him with your silence." Yi Hyun lay perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm only he could feel. He listened to the sound of the syringe clattering onto the tray as Soo-min's hand finally went limp. He heard the rustle of silk as his wife, the woman who had shared his bed and plotted his murder, retreated toward the door, her footsteps no longer clicking with confidence, but stumbling with fear. The door closed with a heavy, final thud. The room was silent again, save for the mechanical asterisk hiss-clack of the ventilator. Yi Hyun waited for Ara to leave, for her to go celebrate her victory. But she didn't move. He felt her sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping where Soo-min had sat only minutes before. She reached out and traced the line of his jaw, her touch no longer deferential. It was possessive. "She's gone, Yi Hyun," Ara whispered, her voice warm with a dark triumph. "The house is quiet. The lawyers are gone. Your wife is a ghost. It's just you and me now, just like the shipyard." She leaned down, her hair falling like a silken curtain around his face, sealing them into a private world of shadows. "You can open your eyes now, boss," she murmured. "The play is over." The mechanical asterisk hiss-clack of the ventilator was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic pulse that had defined Yi Hyun's existence for days. But the rhythm was a lie. The stillness was a lie. And as Ara's hand rested heavily on his chest, not as a servant, but as a master, the lie finally reached its breaking point. Yi Hyun opened his eyes. The light of the room felt like a physical weight, searing into his retinas after so much time spent in the dark. For a moment, the world was a blur of expensive velvet and clinical white, until it resolved into the face of the woman leaning over him. Ara didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or recoil in shock at the miracle of his awakening. She simply stared down at him, her dark eyes reflecting a man who looked far more broken than he felt. Yi Hyun reached up. His movements were stiff, his muscles screaming from days of forced atrophy, but the instinct was still there. He grabbed Ara by the throat, his fingers locking around the high collar of her uniform. It wasn't the grip of a dying man. It was the reflexive strike of a predator who had finally found his target. "Who are you?" His voice was a jagged rasp, a sound of dry earth and buried secrets. Ara didn't struggle. She didn't even try to pull his hand away. Instead, she leaned into the pressure of his thumb against her windpipe, a faint, mocking smile touching her lips. "I told you, boss," she whispered, her voice as steady as the heartbeat monitor she had manipulated. "I'm the girl you left in the fire, but if you're looking for a name that fits your current situation, you can call me your only lifeline." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, sleek tablet. With a flick of her thumb, the screen came to life, divided into a grid of security feeds. Yi Hyun's eyes widened. It wasn't just the bedroom. It was the library where the lawyer had signed the papers, the hallway where Sumin had whispered to Joong-gi, and even the private study where his lieutenants had discussed his replacement. "You faked a coma to watch them," Ara said, her eyes locked on his. "But I faked a life to watch you. I've been recording since the moment you fell into that hospital bed. I have every word Sumin said, every bribe your lawyer took, and every micro-expression you made while you thought you were the only one playing God." She tapped the screen, and the audio of Sumin's death wish played back, clear, crisp, and devastating. "If you kill me now," Ara continued, her voice unfazed by the tightening of his grip, "the cloud server is programmed to release these files to the public prosecutor and the rival families in exactly 1 hour. You'll be a hero for 5 minutes and a corpse by dinner. Without me, you have no evidence, no leverage, and no empire. You're just a man in silk pajamas holding a maid by the throat." Yi Hyun felt the power shift in the room, a physical tilt that left him lightheaded. He had spent his life building walls of control, thinking he was the architect of his own destiny. But Ara had been the one laying the foundation in the dark. She had turned his mansion into a panopticon, and he was the prize exhibit. He slowly released her, his hand trembling as it fell back onto the silk sheets. He was the head of the Xingguang Syndicate, a man feared by the most ruthless killers in the city, yet he felt smaller than he had in the shipyard 20 years ago. Ara straightened her collar, her expression returning to that of the invisible, obedient servant. She picked up the tablet and tucked it away, looking down at him with a terrifying, protective warmth. "The board meeting is in 3 days, Yi Hyun," she said, her voice reclaiming its melodic chill. "Sumin is gone, but the wolves are still at the door. You're going to wake up tomorrow. You're going to be the miracle, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you." She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear one last time. "After all, boss, we wouldn't want another fire, would we?" The recovery of Kang Yi Hyun was hailed as a medical miracle, a headline that flickered across every news cycle in the city. To the public, he was the invincible titan who had clawed his way back from the brink of the abyss. To the syndicate board, he was a resurrected god returning to reclaim his throne with a vengeance that left the hallways of the mansion stained with the metaphorical blood of his detractors. But inside the walls of the sterile fortress, the truth was far quieter and infinitely more hollow. Han Sumin had vanished. The official story was a retreat to a private clinic in Jeju for nervous exhaustion following the trauma of her husband's illness. The reality was a silent, forced exile, her bank accounts frozen, and her reputation held hostage by the digital files Ara kept locked in a vault only she could access. Joong-gi, the rival who had dared to touch Yi Hyun's bed, had met a swifter, darker end, not at Yi Hyun's hand, but through an anonymous tip to the authorities that exposed a decade of money laundering. It was clean. It was efficient. It was Ara's style. Yi Hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, the city lights sprawling beneath him like a carpet of diamonds. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture as rigid and commanding as ever. Yet, as he looked at his reflection in the glass, he didn't see a king. He saw a man who had traded one cage for another. The door behind him opened. There was no knock. There was no need for one anymore. Ara walked in, no longer wearing the muted gray of a servant. She was dressed in ivory silk, the fabric shimmering like a blade in the moonlight. She didn't bow. She didn't wait for permission to speak. She walked to the heavy mahogany desk and set down a single folder, the agenda for tomorrow's board meeting. "The lieutenants are settled," she said, her voice a calm, melodic tide. "I've restructured the shell companies in the Caymans. The lawyer has been replaced by someone who understands that his life is a privilege, not a right." Yi Hyun turned to face her. He looked at the woman who had been a ghost in his halls, the girl he had once abandoned in a shipyard fire, and the master who now held the keys to his kingdom. "You've dismantled my life and rebuilt it in your image, Ara. Do you expect me to thank you?" "I expect you to play your part," she replied, her eyes devoid of the warmth she had shown him when he was paralyzed. "You are the face of this empire, Yi Hyun. You are the power that people fear, but I am the truth that sustains it. We are a partnership of necessity." She moved to the head of the long, obsidian dining table that dominated the room, the seat where Yi Hyun had always sat alone, asserting his dominance over his subordinates. She pulled out the chair at the head and waited. Yi Hyun walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. He sat down, the leather creaking under his weight. For a moment, he felt the old surge of authority, the phantom weight of the crown. But then Ara did something that shattered the illusion. She didn't move to the side. She didn't take a seat at his right hand. She leaned over the back of his chair, her arms draping over his shoulders in a gesture that was half embrace and half shackle. Her fingers, cool and steady, rested against his throat, right over the pulse that had once flatlined in a lie. "The world sees the boss," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin, a haunting echo of the midnight confessions in his sick room. "But we know who really owns the air you breathe." She sat in the chair immediately to his left, her hand remaining over his on the table. The final shot of the Kang dynasty was no longer a solitary man in a high tower. It was two figures at the head of the table, bathed in the cold light of a new empire. Yi Hyun looked straight ahead, his jaw set in a mask of iron, while beside him, the woman who had broken him watched the door, waiting for the world to come to them.